The world of classical music is considered extremely conservative. That's not true. Stay tuned, and today I explain you why. Hello, back again. This is innovative Edgar. No, it's not true, but without innovation, there would be no evolution. And today we go a little bit deeper into this subject where innovation stands versus tradition. Now, apparently, everybody who plays the violin, the viola, the cello, the double bass with the bow and is learning years to play it well is considered extremely slow motion, extremely patient, extremely conservative. Reality is a little bit different. Just let's go back at the time of Stradivari when all the instruments were Baroque instruments, which means there was a complete different neck. The neck was not inserted into the body of a cello or a violin or viola, but was nailed, first glued and nailed on the ribs. The neck was much flatter, and the neck angle was created by a fingerboard, the Baroque fingerboard. It was shorter, larger. The strings were just out of plain gut from, I don't know which kind of animals. I'm not a string expert here when it comes to gut strings. And then things have changed. The requirements have changed. And now what we describe nowadays for just the violin went through a transformation. You could see it more from the craftsmanship, that they just took off the neck and made a new neck and planed a new fingerboard and inserted the neck and things like this, and they put it on a different bridge. But everything started very likely much different. It all started that someone out there back in those years had made a test and pulled up a metal string. That's all. Back in those days, that was definitely a step of innovation, something which, like, instead of a rope, a chain, yeah, more or less, yeah. That was more stable, it kept the tuning, it was louder, and that was exactly what they were looking for. And then now this works, and then one does it, and then also the other one, and hey, this violin is louder, what did you do? Oh, I do that this way, and it's like a fire. And then the transformation of all the Baroque instruments has started. Now, that doesn't mean that now I don't like Baroque music. I love it, and it's still nice to love. It's a little bit slower and a different tone, more mellow, everything nice. But it's like vintage cars and nowadays cars, okay? Within the vintage cars, you have different periods of the cars which have been made. And the same with the music, with the strings, and what kind of, how you transform the instrument to a Baroque, how it has been transformed, how it has been originally. There are so many things and steps, yeah? But the step that they're changing was because of innovation. Now, for those who just think, well, violins, oh, what a boring subject, you know. For somebody outside of our world, the whole thing seems frozen and nothing is moving. And damn, what a boring job. They always do nothing else than just another violin. And if you have so many violins, what the hell? Why do you go and make another violin? Yeah. The ones who are well informed about Edgar and his great team, they just want to check them all. And then they test everything. And what's the most expensive violin? And then they test that one. So in a sudden, the whole shelf here becomes completely different. And the difference is from one instrument to another. Who made it? Of course, this is nothing to do with innovation. But our instruments nowadays, all these instruments, even the Scala Perfetta, the Linea Macchi, and all our master-made instruments have a lot of innovation inside. How can I explain that to you? After the World War, we split it up in generations. That's actually a good point of view, you know. Just imagine at a certain point, there was no violin making anymore here in Cremona, yeah? Up to that point, there were a lot of makers, and then there came First and Second World War, and then it was gone, yeah? They really knocked it out. People had different problems, and the violin makers who were here were working in town had to make their handles of rifles and other things out of wood, and probably knives and whatever, yeah? So then after the Second World War, they had to restart creating again the Cremonese violin school. there were a lot of things going on. The secret has been lost and whatever. And in some parts it could be like the wood preparation, which I made a lot of videos about. It's not that I now found the right secret of Stradivari, but very likely there must be something in what has to do also with these kind of things. Those things have lost, but other things have been recreated. And within this recreation, within this process, now that I'm here already for the past over 40 years in Cremona, while I was here, I have already seen the whole transformation within those 42, 43 years. People before, right after, they just made everything that looked like a violin. So they made a lot of ribs. They had to focus on purfling, how to fit the corners and how to make the scroll line. They were talking a lot about the scroll and everything. Scroll talk was for me always a little bit something. There's not so much to evolve in order to get a better result. I think it's more a question of personal style, but that's just the aside. But when it comes to sound, there were a lot of people here in town, people who made the violin making school, who dedicated a lot of their work for research and contributed for the makers here in town that things went on a little bit quicker. Parallel to what was going on in Cremona, we have on the other side of the ocean, we have the United States, which have been 40 years ago extremely innovative, extremely ahead of us, and their way of working was definitely much better than the Cremonese makers. Yes, I say that I work in Cremona, but this is probably because they didn't have that gap, which was here in Europe and here in Cremona especially, when no violin making was going on. And then in those years, probably in America, people were keeping on with Wurlitzer and Sacconi and all these makers, and René Morel and all these great makers from the past who passed already away, but kept on a very high level of making. And then the new generations came in and they took all that information and had those masters in New York or wherever and kept it on. So their level was higher, their standard was higher, and there was no need in those years to get things from Cremona, at least not contemporary made ones, only the old ones. So they bought antique instruments and then they revised them and made them sound very well. Here in Cremona, people had to reteach themselves everything from zero, and it took a little bit longer. But nowadays there is no city where there are more than 200 violin makers in one city building new violins. Maybe somewhere in China, but they make a completely different thing, and people who are working there have a completely different mindset. They are not focused on doing something in the same way how we do it. It would be like that we make now here some traditional Chinese instruments where we don't have any traditional relation to this instrument. We just would make it to make profit. That's the way why Chinese instruments are where they are. Because maybe the business owner is willing to make it better, but the workers don't have this relation to this instrument. Yeah. So at a certain point, we have to understand that up to the point that somebody, a freak in physics, has the idea after he was going with his sailing boat that he could take his Kevlar rope and use it as part of the tailpiece gut, and for instance, could be a sound innovation. And then he did it and it sounds well. Or somebody put it on a titanium gut string, a titanium fine tuner. Somebody out there was the first one and he did it. And there was innovation because nobody else did it before. And then they realized, damn, there is something changing, you know? Or just on a cello. On a cello, there are so many things for high tech. There you can take these screws here out and you put them out of titanium, and then damn, it sounds already better. Or you can change the end pin, the dual-rod end pin. Damn, they're really good. Of course, because somebody is changing something, there comes a different result, okay? And this we call innovation, because to that point that nobody made, let's say, a violin without F-holes and cuts in some holes into the ribs, you don't know how important the F-holes are. And if I made for my osmium violin that C is longer, but then I try to give it a slightly beautiful touch, like the corners like a Strat, but still longer C's like a Guarnieri, that's innovation. That I made the ribs in a sandwich way with wood, carbon fiber and wood, that's innovation. And so our instruments here have innovation. And let's say here, this is a testore. This is made by Stefano. If you want to play on my testore, go to Sinwin. I think it's the best violin I've ever made up to that point today. And I'm happy that I can tell you that you can go to Sinwin Music in Singapore and test it. I think it sounds super great. I think it must be the best sounding violin at Sinwin at the moment. And there I also have this fine tuner in titanium. I have the strings from Tomastic, I think. Yes, Tomastic. Kevlar and titanium end pin, titanium screw. This is all innovation. Without that, you wouldn't achieve such a high quality. And when we talk like this, nowadays, all our production has a certain quality like this. And that's the reason that when I heard that I can have an instrument from Stefano Conia, I have actually a viola and a violin from him here. He's now over 80 years old. He was my varnishing and restoration teacher in violin making school here in Cremona. And he is an outstanding maker. And he makes a lot of instruments. And he's super quick. And when I look at his violins, I just say, damn, I want to own it. And on the other side, I look at it and say, wow, how things have changed. Here, this instrument is all authentic. Even the bridge and everything is just like Stefano Conia made his violin. This is an icon in violin making. He came here from Hungary within Cremona. Before there was Pisolotti and Morassi. And then it was Long Nothing, and then Conia. He is the oldest living Cremonese maker who is still in business, and you go to his workshop and he's busy making one after another. I think it's interesting because it's a timeless masterpiece which reflects very nice the making of back of those years. And between his generation and mine, there are another 2 or 3 generations. And he was not the maker, or at that time they weren't the makers who were very innovative. Innovations back in those years was made by some sound freaks, physics, who in their free time dedicated violin sound research, and then they wrote in some violin making magazines or conferences, they talked about their result. And only slowly those things have been applied for nowadays making. I hope you like this kind of information. I hope you understand the message and you appreciate it. And that's why you also subscribe to my channel. Thanks. See you next time. Bye bye.